Hello and welcome back to Geek and Speak, the Geek and Seek podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about how to build your land base, how to get your mana in sorts for your games. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Commander. But I think at least a decent amount of what we're going to be talking about will carry over to other formats as well. But that's the main thing we play on the channel. So that's the main thing we'll be focusing on. So we're going to, as an outline, do our introductions, go over a couple news things in the world of Magic. And then we're going to go talking about how many lands should you be running? How do you balance that with how many colors are in your deck? How many tap lands can you run and still get away with it and keep up with the game? How does budget fit into it? How do mana rocks fit into it? How do MDFCs fall into it? Where do fetch lands fall into this? We're going to get into all of that nitty gritty stuff. And then depending on how much time we have at the end, we have a couple questions from the fans that we will get into answering. So if you have any questions for anyone, ask them in our Discord or leave a comment if you're watching this on YouTube. And then we might also have a little bit of time to talk about something fun outside of the world of Magic. But let's get into our introductions. Hi, I'm your host, Morgan. My life's been pretty good lately. I got that new job I was wanting. I'm now the podcast editor for the Commander Clash at MTG Goldfish. So that's been really cool. And yeah, life's been pretty neat. Elsewhere, Magic on Vegas was a lot of fun. Got to meet a couple of you guys there. So that was really, really cool. But also with me today, I have my good pal, Preston. How's it going, Preston?
Pretty good. This weekend I went to my niece's first birthday party,
Oh,
and
fun.
today I'm gonna be ordering a new laptop, so things are
Heck
going
yeah.
pretty well on my end.
Heck yeah. And we also have Jason joining us today. Jason, how's it going, man?
Oh, it's going pretty good. I don't know if anybody remembers from the last podcast, but I wore this jersey. I'll probably be wearing this jersey until football season is over. So you'll see it a lot in the podcast and in other videos that we put out. You'll probably be seeing it quite a bit.
You are also
And
wearing it in the Wilds of Eldraine gameplay.
oh, that was it's just been a good few weeks to be a Detroit Lions fan. So yeah, I've
Fair
been
enough.
enjoying life.
Fair enough, man. All right. So let's go ahead and hop into the meat and potatoes of this podcast with first going over a little bit of Magic news. So again, like I said, Magic on Vegas was dope. If you guys were there, I know Wizards is really wanting feedback on things that can still be improved. So if you were there and you have feedback to give Wizards, make sure you find that forum, give them that feedback. We also at Magic on Vegas, we're getting a lot of preview stuff for Caverns of Ixalan. We will be getting making Ixalan, Caverns of Ixalan related content here on our channel. So if there's specific stuff you want to see, make sure you leave a comment and let us know. Do you want us to do a tier list of all the new commanders? Do you want us to do any unboxing videos? Is there like some kind of commentary thing that you think might be interesting? We are going to be doing a gameplay. I believe there are going to be 4 commander precons for the set, one for each of the main supported tribes. So you can't expect that, but outside of that, if there's any specific things you want to see, let us know. And then also Doctor Who stuff officially releases on the 10th. And that is going to be somewhat kind of the main topic of the next episode of this podcast. We're going to be talking about Universes Beyond in general, but we're intentionally timing out to where it lines up with the Doctor Who release. And I don't know if you can see this, but just today I got from Wizards all of the precons and a collector booster box for Doctor Who. We're probably going to do some kind of giveaway for the box, but we'll see. We'll see what we think about here on our side of things. But are you guys excited for Ixalan and or Doctor Who?
Am I excited for the dinosaur set? Don't ask me silly questions.
Well, did you see they're alongside it? They're doing a Jurassic Park secret lair.
Yes, I,
Um,
I looked at that. It looks very good.
it looks so fun. I love Jurassic Park so much.
Ixalan, I haven't kept up with the new cards that are coming out. If there's been any spoilers, anything like that.
Just a few. We haven't officially started spoiler season. There's only a handful of stuff that's out there right now.
But the first Ixalan was crazy. I think that was really about the first time I started playing Commander frequently. And at the local game store that I would go to, a couple people had dinosaur decks. I mean, there was Galta and Atla Polani. There was just a bunch of them all over the place, and they were all super strong. So going back to Ixalan, it should be a really good time. I mean, isn't Ixalan where we got Atali?
Yep. Yep.
That's one of my favorite dinosaurs that's ever been released. I have so much fun with that card every time I play it.
I have such mixed feelings about Ixalan. On one hand, it's really cool, but it's also so like jumbled. Like there's just so much going on. Like it's pirates and they're hunting for treasure, and there's so much tribal support and all these weird, awesome things on the island. And at the same time, it's like, slow down. There's so much going on. And it was such a boring standard set. Like I still kind of play standard. It was such a boring standard set because the set was so weak, but at the same time there was so much awesome stuff for Commander. Like specifically the dinosaur support was really awesome. But
yeah, and that's probably why we need to go back there, is just because there was so much going on. There was so much going on the first time that we need to go back and revisit it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you guys heard, but they have it set up to where when they were designing the set, it wasn't originally supposed to be Ixalan, but as they were designing the set, it's like a exploring caves kind of theme, and they were like, I think this would go better if this is set on a world that people already know. And so then they started changing things about it to make it Ixalan. So I think that'll be like a nice fun twist on it as well. Some familiar and a lot of new. So that'll be cool. So let's go ahead and hop into the main conversation. How to build your land base and your mana base as a whole in Commander. And I think we're going to just come right out and start off with the most controversial one in our play group. And that is, how many lands should you run in your deck? All right. So in Commander, you have 100 card singleton other than your basics. What percentage of your deck needs to be lands? Jason, with the hot takes, you start.
29 to 36%. That's what I would say personally.
Man, few lands.
When I'm building my decks, I usually put between 30, typically. Sometimes it's less. It just depends on the mana curve and who the commander is and what the deck's trying to do. But I'll typically put 30 to 36 on the higher end. Now, I do have I think one deck that I have more than 36 lands in it, but I'll talk about that later. I don't find that it hurts me too often. I mean, there's definitely games where I'm not drawing enough lands or enough mana, and I feel like we all have those games, but I don't think that happens to me more frequently than anyone else. And not to be this guy, but I think my win percentage on the channel kind of supports that.
So Preston, what is your opinion on how many lands you should be running?
Well, it definitely depends on what your deck is trying to do, but I think a safe starting point will always be 35.
35. Okay, so that's also still on the lower end. So for me, I start off when I start brewing a deck, because I always have to do a lot of cuts when I build decks. Like when I build a deck, I end up with like 120 cards, and I'm like, oh crap, I gotta cut this down to 100. When I start building a deck, I start at lucky number 37. And then depending on how my curve is looking, by the time I'm almost done making cuts, I'll change it. So if I am making a deck and it's like, whoa, the curve is like insanely high, then I'm going to add one or two more lands. If my curve is insanely low, I'll cut one or two. So it depends on my deck. I have my CEDH deck where the curve is like 2. It's less than 2. It's like 1.8 or something. That deck, yeah, I only run like 33 lands in it or something. But all of my normal decks, my normal casual, normal playing commander decks, they range anywhere from 36 on the low end to I have one deck that's like 39 or 40. But yeah, 37 is kind of my lucky number to start off with. So that's a little higher. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of numbers to back up my reasoning there. And I'm also going to give some further justification than just the numbers. So let's look at 60 card formats, competitive formats. The average decks, and it's going to vary a little bit, but people are running anywhere from 21 to 24, sometimes 25 lands in their 60 card decks. That is somewhere in the 35 to 41% of cards in your deck should be lands. So that means in Commander, you should be running somewhere between 35 to 42 lands. And again, I think the biggest justification to that is going to be your curve. If your curve is really low, you could probably get away with only a couple spells, or you could get away with less lands. And then if your curve is high, you need to make sure that you never miss a land drop. The other thing I want to add to that, though, besides the fact that that means that you guys aren't running enough lands, the other justification for that is if your curve is low, wouldn't it be nice if you're hitting a land every turn so that as the game goes on, you could start like casting multiple spells a turn? Like you might be like, okay, my curve in this deck is like 2, so if I miss a land drop here and there, not that big of a deal. But wouldn't it be nice if you were still hitting a land every turn so that you could be double spelling or triple spelling even? Because if you're only playing one spell a turn, that does slow down the progress of the game, as well as if you are ramping, if you ramp in growth or something, but then you miss a land drop anyways later in the game, it's the same thing. You just wasted a turn casting that 2-mana spell instead of a different 2-mana spell. Or if you're doing a lot of your ramp using mana rocks and then someone Vandal blasts, it does, you want to make sure that you would hit your land drops every turn anyways. So now the best remedy to that is just run a bunch of card draw so that no matter how many lands you run, you're next to guaranteed to always hit your land drop. But the other part of that is just run more lands. Do you guys have anything to add to my rebuttal?
You talked about when you're building a deck, you start with, magic number 37, you try to get down if you have to. Ideally, I will look at a commander and I will say, can this commander work with 70 non-land cards? And depending on the mana curve of my commander, and then once I start adding pieces to it, I'll get to a point where it's like maybe I'll have 33 or 34 lands. And then at that point, I'll go through the curve and I'll say, okay, this is kind of sitting at like 3.6 or like a 4 on average. So I want to make sure that I'm getting lands. So 34 might be a good place to stop. But like Tatiova, my Tatiova deck, that's 5 mana. But what Tatiova wants to do is centered around lands, getting lands onto the battlefield. And so because the deck is built around playing as many lands as possible, it almost feels like Tatiova is at times like 3 mana or 4 mana, even if I've cast her more than once from the command zone, just because I've already, one turn, I might have 4 lands out. The very next turn, I might have 9.
Well, I guess that is a factor that needs to be considered. I think most of what we're talking about today should just be used as like a starting point. I don't think it should be like the gospel or anything. You should just take it as a starting point, because like if you are an artifact deck, you want a bunch of mana rocks, right? If you are a land deck, you probably want to run a handful more lands than you would in the average deck, just because your deck is built around hitting land drops. Like when I played that land deck on episode 11 of our gameplay show, I probably should have run more lands than I did because I was a land deck that was missing land drops. So,
here's the thing though. And I'll get into this a little bit later. Even in my Tatiova deck, I run, so in the 1-to-1 comparison that you just made, so like between 35 and 42 lands, I have less than 40 lands in that deck still.
Do you know how many lands you have though?
I do. We will get to that.
Okay.
Later.
All right. Well, President, did you have anything to add to my rebuttal on you're better off just making sure you always hit a land drop? Because if you miss a land drop and you get Vandal blasted or you wasted a ramp and growth and miss a land drop anyways, then you're just in the same place, because you want to make sure that you're keeping up with the rest of the table. So the best remedy to that is run more lands. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, when I said 35 is my starting point, at least for me, that's because most of my decks are 1 to 2 color, maybe 3. I rarely go above that, just a few that are 5. And with most of my decks, I think the average CMC is about 3 or 4. So like I normally don't really have too many problems missing land drops. And I play a lot of green, which works in other formats, but you don't see a ton of like ramp spells in other formats as compared to a commander at least. So I think that makes up for having a lower percentage than other formats typically. Not to mention all the mana rocks that normally don't get run in other formats.
Sure. That is a great point, but what if you just miss a land drop after ramping growthing? Then you're just in the same place, and you could have played a different 2-mana spell. Or what if someone Vandal blasts all your mana rocks away?
What if someone casts Wrath of God turn 4? You can say what if all the time, but
I guess.
I think overall,
Yeah, I agree with
I
that.
think Commander just works a little better.
I don't think building a deck or planning for like every single what if situation is necessarily smart, because there's what 22 plus thousand cards in in existence for this game. You can only put 99 into a deck. So yeah, you have it seems like a near infinite amount of options to choose from when it comes to strategizing for different things, but you're not going to be able to account for every single what if scenario that comes up. Sure. So, plan for the big stuff, the stuff that is probably going to happen, but focus more on what your deck is trying to do. Things that you have that are either making your spells cost less or are giving you additional mana that aren't lands. I don't think worrying about losing those things is a smart strategy when it comes to building a deck. So every game you play, stuff you have is going to get destroyed. It's going to happen. So just add in more pieces of what your deck is trying to do, make it a little bit more redundant. That way, if those pieces get destroyed, it doesn't matter because you have backups.
And that is a good
point.
If
you're always missing your land drop, put more in, obviously. But
yeah,
if you aren't having troubles with it,
if you're always missing your land drop, my famous line is shuffle better.
That is a great line, and it's a great piece of advice. We might just have to agree to disagree. I'd like to know what the viewers think. I do see a lot of people when they send in their deck list, like on our Discord, they are doing what you guys are doing. They're just like, I'm just going to run 33 lands and hope for the best, which,
33 lands is so many. That's a lot.
Oh my God. But
I have gone above that number for most of my decks at this point.
Okay. Well, that's good. So moving on to the next part is we've kind of already talked about this, but I want to make sure that if there's any notes we wanted to add that it gets mentioned. How does your curve affect how many lands you run? So for me specifically, I mentioned that I start with 37, and if my curve is looking low, I'll cut 1 or 2, and if my curve is looking high, I'll add 1 or 2. So that's kind of like my range. But I think a big part of it that I don't think has really been mentioned is that your commander needs to be a factor in this. Like, for example, my Muldrotha deck it's got a pretty low curve. However, Muldrotha is 6 mana, and the deck doesn't do that much if Muldrotha's not in play. So I have to get to that point.
And Muldrotha is a lightning rod for removal.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have to keep that in mind. So I probably run more lands in that deck than you would think I need to based on my curve. But because the deck is so reliant on the commander and the commander is so much mana, that is something I had to factor in when deciding how many lands to run. So what do you guys have to add to that? How much does the commander factor in specifically? And then how does your curve factor in? I know we've already talked a little bit about the curve, but I wanted to see if you guys had any final thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think my commander probably affects things more because I do try to really keep things within that 3 mana range in most of my decks. So I will add or subtract a lot of lanes depending on the commander. Like my Sliver deck, I just pulled that up. The average CMC in that deck is around 3 or so, but it's a 5-color deck, so I'm running 39 lands.
Well, and that's probably good too, because is the commander 5 mana?
Yeah, 5.
Yeah.
The number of lands I put in my deck is 100% determined by my mana curve. I don't have any set number of lands that I ideally would like to put in any deck. Like I said before, I usually start with can I get 70 cards in this deck and run this deck with 30 lands? That's kind of an average number I like to hit. But I'll go a little bit more than that. I'll go a little bit less than that. It just depends on what my mana curve is.
So I think, and maybe that is in part at least a testament to the kinds of decks that you play. Because like I'm probably not thinking all of them, but I'm just trying to think of the kinds of decks that you play. And a lot of your decks can kind of work without the commander in play. So if you like say you like let's use Thalise, is that what she's called? The Orzhov one you have. So let's use that deck as an example. Because that's like I think still our most popular video. So a lot of the people who are watching this have probably seen that video. It's a 5-mana commander, right? So if she gets removed a couple times, say you play her, someone Path to Exiles, you play her again for 7 mana, someone board wipes. You're now looking at a point where your commander is not realistic to come back and carry much weight in the game. You're looking at if she comes back, it's taking up my entire turn. So is it even worth it anymore? But the 99 of that deck, from what I remember, functions okay whether or not she's in play. She's great. She's important. She's helpful, obviously. But you're going to be gaining life. You're going to be making tokens. You're going to be doing all of this, whether or not she's in play anyways. So, and I think people should be doing that more. Like, I am starting to build more and more of my decks in a way that they function whether or not my commander's in play, just because commanders get removed. But there are a couple decks I still have, though, where like, yeah, the commander needs to be out. Otherwise, the deck doesn't do much. But in general, I'm trying to do that less and less. And I think that's how you're kind of able to get away with that, too, is just because a lot of your decks just function whether or not the commander's in play. Do you have any decks that you know for sure, like, oh, that's not true?
Tovolar for certain.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
if I don't,
It draws you cards.
if I don't have Tovolar out, number one, I'm not drawing cards. Number two, I can't. Having all these wolves and werewolves out doesn't really do a whole lot for me unless I'm putting more werewolves out. So it's like if I don't have Tovolar on the battlefield, I basically have to spend more mana just to catch up to where I would be if I did have Tovolar on the battlefield.
Let's also talk about mana rocks. So mana rocks are obviously important because white is really good at catch up ramp, and if you're sequencing your turn right, white is just good at ramp in general. But like green is kind of the only like land ramp color. So now all these other colors are having to find other ways to ramp, and mana rocks are obviously great at doing that. Obviously Soul Ring is an auto include in almost every deck. There's very few decks that don't want Soul Ring, but that actually puts you ahead of mana, so I think maybe you should run it in every deck, especially because it's like $1. But mana rocks are just an important way to not only ramp you, but also just fix your mana, especially if you're on a budget. Are you going to buy more dual lands? If you're on a budget, are you going to buy more dual lands? Or are you going to buy some signets? You know, they're a lot cheaper. But they also ramp you as well as fix your mana. So when you guys are building, how many mana rocks are you adding into your deck on average? And does that at all affect the number of lands you're putting into your decks?
I think for me, I'd probably say 5 to 7 mana rocks. That way I have some artifact ramp, but not too much in case there is something like a Vandal Blast that comes out.
3 to 7, kind of like what Preston's saying, right around in that range. I don't want to, overload my deck with artifacts that only make me mana, but I do want to make sure that, if I need specific colors, I can get it, or if I just need that 1 or 2 extra mana, I can get that onto the battlefield. So I don't go crazy. 3 to 7.
What about mana rocks that have some other kind of utility? I mean, that probably varies a lot depending on your deck. But like, let's say,
like the Celestis in my
that's a great one.
deck.
It cares about day night. It loots. Like there are decks that care about it.
It does other things besides just that one ability that says tap, add 1 mana of any color.
Yeah. So for me, it when I'm building a deck, I'm trying to run somewhere between 8 to 10 pieces of ramp of some sort, and that comes in many shapes and forms. That'll be land ramp if I'm playing green, white, catch up ramp if I'm playing white. That'll be the mana rocks. That'll be treasure makers. Depending on the deck, I'll also count cards like Explore, Growth Spiral, cards like that. I sometimes count that as a ramp card. But because it doesn't guarantee you the extra land, I don't always count it. So that's kind of my sweet spot is I try to run somewhere around 10 pieces of ramp in my deck. So depending on my colors is really determining how many mana rocks I'm running. If I'm not playing green, most of my ramp pieces will be mana rocks, except Wayfarer's Bauble, but that's still an artifact. I run Wayfarer's Bauble in most of my decks because it's land ramp that any color can have. And it's not an expensive card, both in actual financial value and in mana access for the game. So I think that's a good card that people should probably be playing more if they're not. But I will say that I don't know as if the number of mana rocks I have has ever affected the number of lands I've put into a deck, which is the main reason I brought it up. The only time I can think about it is the episode of Upkeep that's coming out this Friday. I was running Myria. In Myria, I think I was running 36 lands, which is like probably more than I needed in that deck, but a lot of them were like fetch lands. So it effectively isn't as many total lands on board, but that's because Myria turns all of your artifacts into mana rocks. So I just have like absurd amounts of mana at all times. So that's the only time that I've been like cutting lands actively because I'm like, I'm just going to have a lot of mana rocks. But otherwise, I don't think I've ever done that. So let's carry this on into something I think that'll be a little bit more of an interesting part of the conversation. So when you are building your commander decks, one color decks are really easy. You're going to run a lot of basics. You're going to run a handful of utility lands that are feeding into your theme, but your mana base is pretty straightforward. But when you start going into 2 to 5 colors, you're having to think about a lot more factors. You're having to think about how many basics do I keep? How many dual lands am I running? And then when I start adding those dual lands, can I have many tap lands and still get away with it? Because if you have to think about if you're playing your land for the turn and it comes in the battlefield tapped, that is effectively being a turn behind in mana. So you don't want to have too many tap lands, but you should run some if you need to. So let's start this conversation off with, we'll spend a few minutes on each of the number of colors. So let's start with 2 colors. If you are playing a 2-color deck, how many tap lands do you think, how many dual lands should you run? And how many of them do you think you could run while coming into the battlefield tapped?
I think for a 2-color deck, maybe 5 to 10 duels, and most of them can come in tapped, I'd say. Because you can still run a lot of basics and be fine with 2-color deck usually.
Obviously, you have to consider availability and affordability.
Yeah, we'll have a section after we talk about this. We'll talk about how much budget is a factor, because it is a factor.
So while with that aside, I would really prefer it if none of my dual lands came in tapped, unless they were, and we talked about this last episode with the precons, unless the deck that I'm building like benefits off of like the land coming in tapped, like the tapped lands that enter and you gain a life, or you scry one or something like that.
If you're playing a deck that cares about gaining life or scrying, then those are great.
Yeah, exactly. But most of the time I try not to run them. I at this point, there have been enough dual lands printed that have conditions where they won't enter tapped, that you really have enough out there so that none of your dual lands have to enter tapped. I typically, if I'm running a 2-color deck, I'll run 7 to 8 dual lands usually, if I can find them, because some colors don't have as many dual lands available as others.
That's a good point too. Yeah, depending on whether it's an enemy color pair or an ally color pair will drastically change how many dual lands you have at your disposal, especially if we're considering budget, which we'll try not to talk about too much of the budget factor until we finish going through the 2 to 5 color pairs. But it is a factor. Preston's completely right though. In a 2-color deck, you can get away with running almost entirely basics. I wouldn't run all basics because you have to have some level of consistency. Because even if your odds are low that you're going to get flooded of just the one color, you can't outrule that. I did used to have a Grand Arbiter deck, and when I first built the deck, I only had basics in it because I was like, it's 2-color, it's pretty split 50-50 on white and blue cost, so I'm just going to run basics and hope for the best. There were a couple games where that screwed me over, and I had to start adding some dual lands in there. So but I think Preston's right. Where you in a 2-color deck, you could probably run almost all basics and it'd be okay. My favorite of the 2-color lands though are the Battle Bond lands because they're almost always guaranteed to come in untapped, and the ones from our most recent trip to Innistrad, the ones that come in.
I was really hoping you were going to pick those because I think those are such good dual lands.
Yes.
I think that they are right up there with the Battle Bond lands, and there are definitely instances where those are better than the Battle Bond lands.
Yeah, that's true. If you get later in the game, the Battle Bond lands will come in tapped, but later in the game, those Innistrad lands, there's no way. There's no way that those are coming in tapped.
It's kind of funny having a Battle Bond land as your first land of the game is really good, but having it as your last land of the game is probably pretty bad. And then having your Innistrad land as your first land of the game is pretty bad, but having it as the last one is probably pretty good.
Yes,
tell me what those ones do again. I'm trying to picture them.
The Innistrad ones, those are the ones that enter tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands. So it doesn't care about basics or anything like that, just as 2 or more other lands.
Yeah, and I would say that both of those will also, those ones that I mentioned will also carry over into the 3-color slot. When I'm building, like grabbing dual lands for 3-color decks, I'm also using those. The other one that I would mention for dual lands that I think are next to auto include in 2-color decks are the cycle that Caves of Koleos is a part of, the Pain lands. So they enter untapped, they tap for colorless, or they can tap for one of either of 2 colors, but you'll deal 1 damage to yourself. I think those are auto include in 2-color decks because they'll always come in untapped, and usually you can sequence it that you don't have to deal the damage to yourself. And if you do, it's only 1 damage. You start with 40 in Commander. That's rarely going to matter. And they're all pretty cheap now. They just got a standard legal reprint over the last year or so. Some of them in Dominaria United, some of them in Brothers War, I think. That sounds right. So they're all pretty cheap now. So I think that in 2-color decks, those are almost auto includes as well. And then 3-color decks, I wouldn't run them as often unless they are like artifact decks, so you just have a lot of colorless spells, or if you're playing some kind of life gain or life loss strategy where the damage really doesn't matter at all. But then as far as other 2-color lands, on a budget, I do like the Scry and the gain life ones. But they also do have like the Prairie Stream cycle where it's like if you have 2 basics, they enter untapped. Those are pretty nice in 2-color decks. But yeah, I think for the most part in a 2-color deck, you can get away with mostly just playing basics, especially if you're playing green. Because if you're playing green, a lot of green ramp is basic oriented, like Cultivate, Kodama's Reach. Those care about finding basics. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So when we move into the territory of 3-color decks, what changes for you guys?
The number goes up, but I think you can still pretty safely stick with a pretty high amount of basics. Maybe instead of, what did we say, 5 to 10, 10 to 15 duels, I'd say is probably still pretty safe. You can get away with, again, especially if you're playing green.
What I notice is I run a lot more utility lands than some people. They definitely don't outnumber like the colored lands and some of the utility lands do tap for a color. It's just most like when I say utility land, I'm talking like Reliquary Tower, stuff like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. A land that does something else. Yeah.
Yeah. But I keep it the same between okay, I won't run 3. I'll definitely have more than 3. I think the least amount of dual lands I'd run in a 3-color deck is probably 5. but I'm really trying to hit that like 7, 8 dual lands. Keep it in that higher area right there. But that's only because I run a lot of utility lands.
So I think a factor of that as well is how many utility lands do you want. So for a 3-color deck right now, I'm looking at my Quasar deck list, which I'm playing in an upcoming episode of Upkeep. I think that's coming out in November is when that episode's coming out. And this deck has 38 lands, and it only has 15 basics. And the dual lands kind of look like what I was mentioning earlier. Like it's, the Innistrad lands and stuff like that. But this deck does have some utility land purposes. So it does have a Reliquary Tower. And it has like the bad fetch lands from Streets of New Capenna because they gain life and stuff like that. So there are probably more utility lands here than I normally would run. So maybe 15 basics is fewer than it should be. I could run more basics than that and still be fine. But when you move into the 3-color territory, there's something important to think about, which is your Arcane Sanctums and stuff like that. So these are like I think they're from like Khan's Block or something. Oh yeah, okay. So Shards of Alara was the first time that this cycle was printed, and they enter tapped, and they tap for one of 3 colors. If you're playing a 3-color deck, yeah, it's a land that's always going to come into the battlefield tapped, no matter what, unless you have like Amulet of Vigor out or something. So that kind of sucks, but it's automatically fixing your mana for all 3 of your colors. And then the upgrade from that, if you're not worried about budget, are the Triome Cycle. So they're fetchable. If you have cards that care about fetching the land types, they do enter tapped always, but they, like I said, with the Arcane Sanctums and stuff like that, they are going to always fix your mana. And then later in the game, if you're flooded out or something, you can just cycle them away and replace it with a different card. So those are also great when you move into the 3-color territory. Did you guys have anything else to add about 3 colors?
This is probably controversial. Oh, you can go first, Jason.
So I was just gonna say, Wizards print more Triomes.
Yeah,
reprint them.
Well, I'm gonna see if I can find the name of the card, but there's one land that I don't think they've ever finished the cycle for that I think is actually really cool, that I think would fit the bill there. So they reprinted it recently. Oh, here it is. So this card is called Murmuring Bosk. I don't think they've ever finished the cycle for it. I might be wrong, but it's a forest, so it can tap for green. And then the other part that matters is it can also tap for one of 2 other different colors, but it'll deal damage to you. And they recently reprinted that in the Salmon Frodo precon. So that's great. It's kind of a 3-color land, kind of. So I think they should. If they haven't finished that cycle, I could just be wrong. I might just be misremembering, but I think it would be cool if they made more of those. I think those are pretty cool. But Preston, you said something about a controversial take, and I like those.
So I figure, I don't know if there's a name for the cycle, but those lands where they come in and sacrifice immediately from New Capenna.
Yeah, those are great.
Basic.
I don't
like them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know. Preston not liking something that gains you life sounds impossible. I've just never really liked those ones. I prefer Terramorphic or Evolving Wilds, letting me choose when I sacrifice them.
Sure.
Yeah,
so,
but having, I mean,
so
in a
okay,
3-color deck, it's probably not ideal to have those. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, no. Okay. 3 colors is the one place I might play them actually.
So I actually do.
Or sorry, I 2-color deck. Sorry.
I actually do sometimes run them in 2-color decks, not very often, but I have built one deck, I think, where it's a 2-color deck that I do run those, just because I cared a lot about fetching for whatever reason. Because maybe you want more lands in your graveyard. Maybe you are really skewed towards one color, so like maybe you only have like 2 mountains, but you have like 16 forests or something like that. So there are, but how much
or landfall?
Yeah,
hello?
They do trigger landfall.
So that's why I really like those lands, is because of the landfall triggers you get off them.
So I think Preston is kind of right. I think the 1 life usually isn't that much of a benefit. But how much of it is when it comes to fetch lands, and we'll have a little bit of a fetch land discussion towards the end of this episode where we can get more into the specifics of fetch lands and their place in this conversation of building your mana base. But do you guys run like Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse? Like they fetch a basic, they can only get basics, they have to come into the battlefield tapped. Do you guys run those? And if so, how much is the timing, the control over the timing? How much is that? Is it an upside over the 3-color fetch lands from Streets of New Capenna? Because I'm not convinced there's that much of a difference.
Multicolor deck I have.
Really?
I run both in all of them. Yep.
Here is the one thing that I will say about those that they have. It's not like you have to activate the ability. The ability just triggers as soon as the land enters the battlefield.
Right.
And I've definitely seen people counter like people using their fetch lands or like their fabled passages. Like
you've seen like people stifle like fetch lands.
I've definitely seen that happen. Now, granted, there are cards that say, triggered ability as well, and that's a triggered ability, but that's the one thing that I'll give them over Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds. That and the fact that there's just more of them. But
I'm gonna be honest, man. If you waste a counterspell on my fetch land, I think I just won that encounter.
Yeah, you're not in a good position if you're stifling someone's fetch land.
Either that, or and this is the situation we were in this game. This dude was just so far ahead and had so many resources available to him. He literally could just throw away a spell on it because he could.
Oh, that's so rude. So I think I would run a couple more basics in a 3-color deck if I was playing green. But if I'm not playing green, I think I'm running about 15 basics. So a little less than half of my lands would be basics. When we move into 4 and 5 color, I'm going to kind of lump them together because I think we're kind of talking about the same kind of crap here. So I think if we're playing 4 and 5 color decks, what are you guys thinking as far as your tap lands and your basics?
In my 5-color decks, I am going to run 10 basics, and then everything else, I'm going to try to make them tap for as many colors as possible.
Yeah. So I think at this point, it's too hard to avoid the budget conversation. Like those 3-color tap lands I mentioned earlier, auto includes. But if you have the budget, you should be getting the triomes. And 100%. I think in a 5-color deck, maybe you don't run every triome or every one of those enter the battlefield tapped for 3-color lands. Maybe you don't run all of them because at that point, let's say you do all of the Shards of Alara ones and all of the triomes. That's 20 lands. That's 20 lands that are guaranteed to enter the battlefield tapped. That's not great. So like my
that's awful, actually.
Yeah,
no,
that's pretty bad.
It's not great. Don't trick anybody, Morgan. That's terrible.
Yeah,
you don't want to do that.
It's bad. I think if you were on a budget, like I have 2 5-color decks in paper. One of them is a Ramos Dragon Engine Charm deck, and it's pretty jank. It was originally built as a budget deck, so most of the lands in that deck just enter the battlefield tapped anyway. So I do just run all of the Shards of Alara tri-lands. My other one is my Kenrith Group Hug deck. And in that one, I'm only running 6 of the triomes. I'm not running all 10 because I felt like if I was running more than 6, that it was slowing down my game too much. Preston, you had a good point though about running 10 basics in a 5-color deck. To some people, that's absurd, and I agree with you. But why don't you get a little bit into why you do that?
There are enough things from your own deck and from everyone else's deck that are going to make you find basics. You should always have at least a couple of all of your colors. That way you have some decent chance of hitting all of your colors at some point.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good philosophy, especially if you're building a 5-color deck.
If you're building a 5-color deck, it's going to be dangerous. Someone's going to hit you with the Swords to Plowshare. Have some basics.
And here's the thing:
exile,
if you take all the basics out, if you don't run any basics, you're eliminating so many cards that you can use. You can't use Kodama's Reach now. You can't use Cultivate. You can't use Rampant Growth.
Yep.
Like you're just taking out opportunities for you to ramp in the game to put yourself ahead of your opponents. So if you don't put basics in there, now it's almost like, okay, I either have to draw them or I have to play all these card draw spells to draw them. or I just have to hope that I get a fetch land in my opening hand and I can search for a land that I need. You're just limiting yourself once you remove all the basics.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's a great addition to that point. I do think that Preston's probably more on the right path, that it should be a protection thing for yourself, because if someone does path to exile one of your really important cards, you want to at least get something out of that exchange. If they spend 1 mana to remove your scariest threat and you get nothing in return, that sucks. Getting a basic land, that's not a lot, but it's not nothing. And then if someone also drops, go ahead.
It can be a ton in a 5-color deck. If you have 4 of your colors ready to go and they get rid of something and you can finally go get your 5th color,
sure,
that can turn you online.
That's true. But I also, what if someone drops a Blood Moon? Like, we don't see a lot of Blood Moons because we don't see that much red. Or I only have Blood Moon, I think, in one of my decks, but it's because the mana base is pretty resilient and it doesn't get wrecked that hard by it.
And we don't see that type of degeneracy in our play group.
But people do play Blood Moon. Like, it's
they do.
Or things that do similar things. Yeah, or cards that do similar things. Like, there's only a couple decks in our play group that have Blood Moon, but it exists. It's a card that exists, and you should be ready to accept your fate. If you're playing a 5-color deck and you have next to no basics, and someone drops the Blood Moon, well, it's been fun, but Sayonara. I'm not doing anything unless that person dies first. So that's something you have to keep in mind. There was another point of protection. Oh, like destroying lands, like a lot of the thing, like Field of Ruin, or there's the new one from Brothers War, like sacrifice that land, destroy a land, but each person gets to go find a basic. If someone does that to you, like if someone does that to like your command tower or one of your triomes or something, that really sucks. But at least being able to get a basic out of it. So running at least a handful of basics in your deck to protect yourself from those screwy situations, totally worth it. But Jason's right too, that it also, there are certain cards like,
and here's what I'm noticing. I don't when I'm building my deck, I don't focus too much about how can I plan for when someone tries to stop me. Now I definitely make sure that I plan for that. I have a good amount of counter spells in decks that have counters, good amount of protection. I mean, if any of you watching saw the least played color game, I was able to protect myself a lot in that game when stuff tried to happen to me. But that's not something I think about a whole lot when I'm building a deck or I'm putting lands in like we're talking about today. Personally, I don't think that that's a good deck building strategy, is how can I just keep my stuff safe? If you focus on that too much, then all you're really focusing on is building the bubble around you, instead of building the tank to take everybody down.
Every deck needs its meat and potatoes to work, right? Like, whether you're playing something really strong or you're playing something really janky, if you're going to have a decent game, you have to play your meat and potatoes. You have to run an appropriate amount of lands, your ramp, your card draw, and you can, customize that to where it better suits your strategy, whether it's a strong or janky theme. But you have to have interaction as well. Interaction is part of that, and you have to know that your opponents are also going to be playing interaction because they probably are aware of that reality as well. And I know certain people have different opinions on how important targeted removal is, or board wipes or whatever. Different people have different opinions on that, but they're running a certain amount of interaction. So I think you have to at least note a little bit, and maybe it doesn't impact your deck building that much, and sometimes it's easy, right? Like if you're playing white and you have a Teferi's protection, you should run it. If you have the One Ring, you should probably play it. And then like we've been talking about today, you should run at least a handful of basics, no matter how many colors you're running, so that if people play those screwy cards, you have some chance of crawling back into the game. Or it doesn't hurt you that bad.
That should just be one factor as to why you add in the basics. It shouldn't be like the main focus.
Yeah, sure. Basics are also a guaranteed tap for a color, enter the battlefield untapped. They are. There's also
nothing wrong with a basic land. It comes in untapped. It gives you the color that you need. Stop hating on basics, people.
Let's talk just briefly about budget and fetch lands. Like if we did talk a little bit about Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, the ones from Streets of New Capenna. There's also cards like Myriad Landscape and what's the Blighted Woodland. There's cards like that you can sacrifice them to go get more lands or whatever. So those are great for budget, especially if you're only playing 1 or 2 colors. But if we're going into the world of real fetch lands, even like Fabled Passage is like a $10 card, maybe it's not that much. But then like real fetch lands are in the like $20 range. So obviously the budget part is a big part of whether or not you're playing fetch lands.
Thank God fetch lands are only $20 now.
They were a lot more.
Yeah, before Modern Horizons 2 came out, dude,
Yeah.
it was like the cheapest one. You could get like a damaged one for like $20, and you could get like a near mint one for like 45.
They vary a lot depending on which one, because certain colors are played more. Like the
Misty Rainforest is the most expensive one.
Yeah, Scalding Tarns, I think, was the most expensive one for a while. It was going for like $90 there for a while, but now I think it's like in the $20-$25 range. So yeah, thank you, Modern Horizons. It was going for $90
to $20. Oh my gosh.
Reprints work, baby. So, but regardless, $20 for one card is still a lot of money. There are 2 decks specifically I have that I don't care about the budget. I'm just going to, even if it takes me a long time to do it, I'm just going to get the cards I need and want, no matter what they cost. I have 2 decks specifically that I do that with. All my other decks, though, I draw a line somewhere. Like the really important cards, I'm going to do it. But when I start moving down the ladder of importance, there comes a line where I'm like, I'm not spending that money. So at what point do you guys think that it matters for fetch lands when it comes to budget?
I personally, when I build my decks, I save a lot of money when I'm building decks because I just have one copy of all the really good cards and the most expensive cards that I use, and I keep those cards in a binder and I put them into my deck that I'm going to play before the game. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time. Nobody in our play group, for those of you out there who might be curious, nobody in our play group complains about it when I do it, when I have to take the time to put my cards into my sleeves. Nobody says anything. Nobody groans or anything like that. And it saves me a lot of money when I'm building my decks. Jokingly. Yeah, it's jokes, but like I don't have to go out and spend $40 on another Teferi's protection, or I don't have to go out and spend another $25 on a Rhystic Study or a Cyclonic Rift. These aren't accurate prices, I'm sure. I'm just throwing numbers out there, but you get what I mean. And since I'm saving that money on those cards, I'm able to use that budget to really focus in on the mana base. And if I want to make it a really like a powerful and synergistic mana base to where I'm virtually never missing a land drop and I'm never missing a certain color or whatever, I can do that because I don't have to spend as much on the really expensive cards that are going to go into the meat and potatoes of the deck.
Yeah. And that is a great point. And you definitely could do that because I do basically the same thing. I keep like placeholder cards in the deck so that if I really just want to play the deck, I don't have to dig it out. And then like if I'm like playing that on camera or something, then I'll actually go through and do that. I find that I haven't done that with very many lands. I have done it with a few. Like I have an Urza Saga that I've done that with. I've done that with Urborg because it's still like $30 or something. But most lands, at this point, somewhere in my collection, I do own almost every fetch land. I'm not doing that with the fetch lands though, because I feel like I'm doing that with other cards already. Like it takes so much time to do that. It is an option. Like if you really do want to have an optimal land base for all of your decks and you don't want to break the bank, just buy one of each fetch land and do that. So that definitely is an option. And also fetch lands, I think get better. Fetch lands get better the more colors you're running. Like the real fetch lands, they get better. Like if you're playing a 2-color deck, sure, Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wells are just fine.
I just want to clarify
very
something
little
real quick.
bit of a difference, but
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify what I'm saying.
Sure.
I don't move the fetch lands between decks.
Okay.
What I'm saying is because I don't have to spend so much money on like the rest of the 99 outside of the land base, because I'm reusing cards that I already have that are expensive, so I don't have to rebuy them. I can buy, I can go out and buy 2 or 3 fetch lands for a deck. And that's like the most I spent on building the deck at all was just those 3 lands. So I have a couple copies of a bunch of different fetch lands that I have spread out over a couple of decks because I was able to save money for the mana base specifically.
It is crazy how much money you can end up dropping on a land base. Like, I know that when we were talking about doing, like I said, the video episode of Upkeep that's coming out this Friday is the $100 budget episode. And when we were planning this season out, we were like, do we want to do another $50 budget episode? Because we did that last season. Do we want to do that again? Or do we want to do a different budget? And when we decided that we were doing a $100 budget instead, Steven and I kind of looked at our decks and we were like, well, now we can like hella upgrade this land base. And honestly, I ended up like, when we changed that, there was like one or two cards I was like, they were just outside of the price range, so I added those. But then the rest of my changing the budget just went to the land base. It really is crazy how much money you spend on lands. The only other thing about fetch lands I want to ask you guys about is there a point where you would stop? Like, let's say budget is not a factor anymore. Let's say budget's not a factor. Is there a point where you stop adding fetches? Because the only so fetch lands are perfectly fixing your mana. If you have a good land base, you have good fetchable lands. Fetch lands are always going to fix you perfectly, and the one damage they're dealing to you doesn't matter. But it is going to be, at the end of the game, it is going to be a less total number of lands you could end up with on the board. Like, let's say I'm playing my lucky number 37 for number of lands in my deck. But if 10 of those are fetch lands, like let's say I'm playing a 5-color deck, let's say 10 of those are fetch lands, that's actually only 27 lands that I could end up with on the battlefield that are actually tapping for mana. So is there like a number that you would cap it off at where you're like, ooh, I don't think I should be running more than that?
The way I built the deck is I focused on getting all of the shock lands and the check lands, and that so far for me has worked out fairly well most of the games I've played with it. So like I spent money doing that, but I didn't have to worry about spending more for fetch lands really.
I will only run fetch lands in decks that I really need to make sure that my colors are fixed. Either that or, I have I think I have a Misty Rainforest in my Tatiova deck just for the landfall trigger.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time I don't use fetch lands that often. I think fetch lands are perfect for fixing your colors, and you can pull out some really, really good lands just because it searches for the land type and not basic. But most of the time I find that it's not really worth losing the one life. And I could just put in a different land. Like, and this, to me, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how there's been enough dual lands printed that come in under conditions where they're untapped, that maybe you don't have to run as many fetch lands because you could just throw that in there, and instead of having to search for a land, you just have it. Because something that people don't understand about fetch lands, it doesn't actually count as a land in your deck if you think about it, because it doesn't tap for mana. You play it and you
unless
don't
you
get
have
any mana out
Urborg or
of it.
Yavimaya in play or
Exactly.
something like that. Yeah.
But now you're adding in another card,
right,
that's going to make that card viable in this way. So people think, oh, I have if I have 35 lands and I have 5 fetch lands. No, you have 31 lands. You don't have 35 lands because you have 4 fetch lands that don't tap for a mana. That's something that people don't really think about too often. And so a deck like, and I actually have, I don't have the exact amount of fetch lands that I have in this deck, but I have the list for a couple of my decks here. And one of them that I got was my Dragon deck, my 5-color, 9-mana commander deck. I have as many fetch lands in there as I can, which I think is only like 3 or 4. But Dragon is one that, like, you need to get your colors and you need to get them right, especially considering that a lot of the dragons are red. And so you want to be able to pull out a red source if you need to. But then also just making sure that you could cast Dragon. So if you're down one color, you have options to go get that one color.
Yeah. The value
a lot of them need multiple pips of the colors.
Right.
Like my sliver decks, all my slivers usually need 1 pip of any color at most. So
See, in dragons, it's not like that. Dragons, you usually need some of them is 1 red, but most of them are like 2 red. A few of them are 3. I know Scourge of Valkus is 3 red and 3, I think.
So I think
Yeah.
in general we're in agreement on fetch lands is it has to be a deck that really matters to you if you're going to spend the extra money. But in general, as far as like not talking about budget, we're just talking about playability. Fetch lands are really important. They go up in value a lot if you have more colors or if you have a lot of cards in your deck that have weird mana costs. Like maybe it's a 3-color deck, but you have a couple cards that have like 3 or 4 of a specific color. If you have like cards like that, then they go up in value a lot.
If you have
but
multiple colors,
you can't think of them. You have to just think of them as fixing. You can't think of them as actual tapping for lands unless you're like playing a black deck that's reliably going to have Urborg in play or something like that. Then you kind of just have to think of them as pieces for fixing. And when you're thinking, well, my curve is this, so I should run basically this many lands, your fetch lands have to make you think I need to add at least a couple more than that. But I think we're all in agreement on that.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I think our only other main thing as far as the lands go was something that Preston added on our notes here, which is that MDFCs, so modal double face cards, are deals with the devil made to entice players into doing stupid and greedy plays, follow the path of the Lord, and just play 2 better versions of each side.
I would immediately like to fight Preston. Immediately. Right now, I want to
not
fight
verbally. We want to fist fight each other.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're just wrong, Preston. You're just wrong. It doesn't entice players into doing anything. Greedy players do greedy things, okay?
Yeah.
I will die on this hill. If you put modal dual face cards in your deck, 90% of the time, you're going to play them as the land. You should play them as the land 90% of the time.
I agree with that. You should, but most people aren't going to because most people are greedy.
Especially considering that there are plenty of ways to put that land back into your hand so you can cast the spell later.
That's a great point. If you're playing bounce lands, MDFCs go up in value a lot.
There's just ways to get it back into your hand. And how many times have you been in a game and like, I love this card, Balagad Recovery. I'll use it as a perfect example.
That's a great example.
So Balagad Recovery, it's green. And on one side, it's a green land that enters tapped. On the other side, it's a 3-mana spell that says you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. How many times in a game have you been playing and you've been down and you're just top decking and you're hoping for that one perfect draw and gosh darn it, it's a land. But what if in that same situation, you draw that Balagad Recovery? It is a land, but it's also a spell that I can utilize to maybe cause something different to happen, turn the tide of this game for me. It gives you more options later on in the game. And if people are playing these cards, if you're sitting out there and you're playing these modal dual face cards and you're holding them in your hand, not playing your land drop because you want to use the spell, you're playing them wrong. If it's the only land you have and you need to play a land, guess what? That's the land that you should play. It doesn't feel good, but it's the most optimal way to play them. And that's why I think that they get a bad rap, is because people don't understand the right way you're supposed to play those cards.
So I think both of you are actually right. Well, Preston, did you have something else you wanted to add?
Well, I was going to say, I do agree with your point with that example, but you literally had to use the best total dual face card available.
It probably is the best.
That is the best one.
So you're both right.
What's the red one?
Valakut Awakening, the one that puts cards on the bottom and you can draw cards. I like that one. There's quite a few that I like, but both of you are right. And here's what I mean by that. Preston's right in the sense that they're both inefficient versions of things that exist, right? Like Balagad Recovery, I think, is the least offensive one, but let's look at it. For 1 less mana, so first of all, most of them on the land side just come in the battlefield tapped. So you could just be playing a basic land instead. And if you're looking at the front side, there's usually a more efficient version. Like if we're looking at Balagad Recovery, okay, for 1 less mana, you could just play Regrowth. Or for the same amount of mana, just slightly harder to cast, you could just play like Eternal Witness. And then it's a 1/1 or a 2/1 or whatever it is that can attack, it can block, it can get bounced, it can get recurred. in all senses, or here's another example. Undo Inversion is another one that I play in a couple decks. It's a overcosted board wipe. It's a complete reset, so that's worth something. Like, it's not just creatures, it's not just artifacts, it is everything. So that is good, and that's something that some decks should think about running. And then on the backside, it's a bad planes. But you have cards like Hour of Revelation, I think is the one. It's a 6 mana card that says destroy all non-land permanents, except it costs 3 colorless less to cast if you meet the requirement. I think it's like there has to be at least 10 non-lands on the battlefield or something. So it's usually only 3 mana. So Preston's right in 2 ways. One, that there usually are just more efficient ways to do the same things. There's usually I can't think of any examples. And some MDFCs are also just not worth it. Some of them are just bad. The other way that Preston's right is a lot of people will say, okay, I should have 36 lands in this deck, but I have 2 MDFCs, so I'm going to count those as my lands and cut a couple lands. That's wrong. But here's how Jason's right. Jason's right because a lot of them are good enough to just run for the sake of value. To have options, because I think options is what makes Commander games more interesting, and it makes people more resilient. Like when those were legal and standard, it led to really exciting games because people just had more options. It's not like a full other card that you had in your hand, but it was kind of like that. So I think if you're playing like the best ones and it really helps your deck, like Balagad Recovery, I would run in almost every green deck if I'm being honest, because and I'm playing enough lands in my decks. Like I say, I'm running somewhere between 36 and 38 lands in my decks. So I usually don't have to play them on their backside as a land, because I'm not counting it as a land slot. I'm counting it as a utility piece. I'm counting it as Balagad Recovery. I need to get something back from my graveyard. Or there's the blue one that draws you an ungodly amount of cards and gives you no maximum hand size. There's Undo Inversion. There are ones that are worth playing just because their effect is powerful, but you're right. You can't think of them as a land. You have to think of it as it's a land if I really
need it.
That
could be a land.
Yeah, you have to
count
think
it as a spell before you count it as a land.
Exactly.
No, no, that's backwards. That's backwards to me. You're going to play that card as your land 90% of the time.
Because because you're smart. Most Magic the Gathering players aren't as smart as you, Jason.
But I need
you to know that. I love you. You're a smart man. But you were in a community of people who were very dumb most of the time.
I'm dumb too. We saw that.
People bought the 30 edition packs, Jason.
Oh my god, that is if you bought that, woof, bud.
Yeah.
But I just
you have too much faith.
And one thing
I think that's a deck building thing though, because Jason's point is that he's usually going to play it as land is because he's also running fewer lands than a lot of other people. Like if like what I said, I'm with Jason as in they're really good and you should play MDFCs. But Jason and I have opposite reasoning, and I think maybe it's not the only reason, but I think the main reason is just I just run more lands in my deck. So I rarely am in a position where it's like, I can't afford to miss a land drop, so I'm going to play the backside of this MDFC. I'm rarely in that position. Jason's probably in that position more, at least maybe not significantly more often, but at least sometimes more often than me, just because he's running like 4 fewer lands in his deck.
And that's just the way
I definitely don't agree with.
I plan for that. I build my deck and I have those cards, and it's like if I get into that situation, it's not like I don't feel bad. I'm not like, oh man, I can't play the other side of this. I have to play the land. It's like, no, okay, I don't have a land drop, so this is gonna be my land drop. Move on, next thing.
Yeah, I think the main thing with MDFCs is you have to, you can't count it as a land most of the time. I think you run it for the option. If you really want the board wipe and Undo Inversion's cool, then it's good. Like I don't think MDFCs are like auto includes in your decks necessarily. I think Balagad Recovery is the closest one to an auto include. But they also, like I said, they do go up in value if you have ways to bounce them back to your hand. So you can play them for the land when you need them earlier in the game, and then when you need the spell later in the game, then you can bounce them or whatever.
This might be less true now, but I think Undo Inversion might also be an auto include just because of how hurt white is as far as like good utility lands. You know, I can't think of a ton of really good white utility lands.
I don't know of a lot of like specifically white utility lands, but like I have a God Eternal Oketra deck, and I do run a lot of utility lands in the deck.
See, but how many of those
Not a lot
utility
that are
lands?
not a lot of them are specifically white cards. They're just
That's what I was saying. Like, how many of them could tap for white? So and that one, like I said, that one might be on the edge of auto include, but I do agree Balagad Recovery should be in a majority of green decks.
we've covered a lot of general things to be thinking about. I don't think we're ending this podcast with, especially because the three of us have different means of building our decks. We have, different opinions on how you should build your decks, especially when it comes to land base. I think we're not going to end this podcast with a list of here's how you build your land base. We're not doing that. But I hope we've given you enough to think about as far as if budget's a factor to you, what are you running? If you're running X number of colors, how many lands should you have? How bad are tap lands? Which tap lands are worth running? How many duels should you have? How many lands overall should you have? How much is your curve, your mana rocks, MDFCs? How much do all of these things play a role in that? I hope we've at least given you enough food for thought to help point you in the direction that's going to work for whatever your specific deck is. Because that's the other thing. Not only are we having differing opinions on the podcast, we're also it's just so broad. Like different decks just need different things. The Tatiova deck cares a lot more about fetch lands than I don't know, just any old 2-color deck, right? So you have to keep that in mind as well. But I hope we've at least given you enough food for thought that next time you build a deck, you can be like, hey, I think I learned something. But did you guys have any closing thoughts as far as land base goes?
I did have one more thought for the Moto Dual Face cards.
Oh, sure.
Don't play the mythic one. You should not spend 3 life for a basic land. That is insane.
I think it's
That's just dumb.
really. Okay,
Statues
so
are
here's the thing.
1, shock lands are 2. You're paying 3 life for a basic that does not have the basic land type.
I think.
That's
I
so
think if
dumb, guys.
if you're
Come
desperate,
on.
if you're desperate, or you could just win the game. Like if you're like, think of all the times I can think of several times where it's been like, if I draw an untapped land, I will win the game right now. There are so many times.
Have a basic.
Yes, you're right. A basic does the same thing. But if I can pay 3 life to win the game, I'm going to do it. Especially in the grand scheme of Commander where you start with 40 life. And I know Preston doesn't like the life as a resource argument, but it is a argument. You can't go overload with it. You can't go overload with it. Like I can't turn 3 Necropotents and pay all my life and expect to win or live, but it's an option.
The only thing that I wanted to go over a little bit is because I think you guys would find it interesting too. I just chose a couple of decks that the channel's only seen 2 of them, but Tovolar, I saw the Commander version of Tovolar.
And you'll be seeing more Tovolar here in the near future. In a week or 2, we'll have a Steven versus Jason Tovolar versus Tovolar gameplay. That was pretty fun. And then also towards the end of the month, I think on the 20th, I think October 20th is when it's coming out. We have a Halloween episode of Upkeep, and Steven's playing his Tovolar deck there. So if you guys like werewolves, you'll see a lot more of it.
Just to start out with Tovolar, so the lands that I run in Tovolar, in the video we talked about it, Steven and I talked about it, I run 28 lands in that deck. 7 of those are mountains, 6 are forests, 8 dual lands. So that's 8 red or green lands, and most of them, I'm pretty sure 6 or 7 out of those 8 have conditions where they will enter untapped. And then I have 7 utility lands. So that's 20 right there. Now, I also have 15 non-land. I just, to make it easier for myself, I just said mana ramp. Not all of those cards are like what you would consider ramp, but that's just the way I classified, like, mana rocks, mana dorks, cards that reduce the cost of spells, ritual effects that give me mana, like just a one-time thing. So I have 28 lands. and then 15 non-land mana type cards. So that's 43. That's almost half of my deck that is either going to be a source of mana or get me to a source of mana. And that works well for that deck because the majority of the spells that are in that deck are 2 or 3 mana, so I don't need a ton. And then Tatiova. This is my lands matters deck, so this is going to be like the highest amount of lands that I'll put in a deck. I have 11 islands in that deck, 15 forests, 7 dual lands, 6 utility lands. Now believe. Yeah, that adds up to 39. So that's 39 lands right there. That's the most lands I'll run in a deck. And then I have 19 pieces of non-land mana source, whether it's like a lot of that I will say is getting lands onto the battlefield, because that's what Tatiova wants to do. But I don't really worry about that. And then, non-green. Both of those have green in it. We got a decent amount of like cards that can search for lands. Let's go something non-green. My Gandalf deck, that's red-blue. I have 7 mountains in that deck, 10 islands, 6 dual lands, 7 utility lands. And then here's the thing. I only have 5 non-land mana sources or things that get me lands, like, Wayfarer's Bauble, things like that. That is one that I would want to look at again. Because that's 30 lands, so it's not like the least amount of lands of any deck that I've built. But there's only 30 lands in it, and maybe I need to add some more mana sources to it. But again, it's not a super expensive as far as mana curve deck, so it works out with what I have. And then for Dragon, the 5-color deck, I run 5 mountains, I run 5 plains, I run 1 forest, 2 islands, and 3 swamps. That I believe is 11. And then I have 8 dual lands, so that's 19. And then I have 10 utility lands. This is 29. And then 4 what I call multicolor. And that's that includes like triomes and lands that tap for any color. So that's what's that? 33, I think that's what that math worked out to. And then 15 non-land sources of mana or like getting mana. So with Dragon, I have a higher number of lands than normal because in that deck, especially with how high of cost Dragon is, I really don't want to miss my land drops. But then I also have a good amount of resources to put lands into my hand. Like I think so that's 34. Yes, 49. That's almost like basically half of my deck is land or getting lands into play. So that's why I think that running fewer lands works out for me, is because I think I run more cards that will pull lands onto the battlefield or at least give me more mana to work with.
Well, yeah, and I kind of mentioned this towards the beginning of the episode, but if you're also just running a lot of card draw, then you're just going to find your lands no matter how many you're running. The only
that's one of that's one of the things that makes it hard for me to get Gandalf's land base figured out, is because I do draw a decent amount of cards in that deck, and I don't necessarily find myself in situations where I'm like, oh, I don't have any lands to play or I don't have any mana to use. I don't find myself in that too much. I just feel like it could be a little bit more fine-tuned.
Yeah, I agree. And I've seen you play that deck a couple times and it works okay. And then I've played it one time. And the one time I played it, I do remember there were 2 turns back to back where I was like, I can't not play a land this turn. So I would like spend my entire turn digging for resources to find a land. That feels bad. So maybe you could tweak it a little bit. But you made a good point about utility lands, which a lot of utility lands are colorless. And I think if it really helps your theme, like I have like a lot of artifact lands and stuff in like my Osgir deck or something, right? So there are situations where you don't care, like maybe it helps you enough, but you also don't want to go absurd. Like if you're playing like a 4 or 5 color deck and you have a lot of like specific colored pips, you probably don't want a lot of colorless utility lands because that's going to really mess you up later on the along. But if you're playing a 1 or 2 color deck, especially, and it really helps your theme, you can play quite a few utility lands and not feel hurt by it. Well, guys, does anyone have any idea how long this episode is right now?
No clue.
Zoom, I thought, had a timer to tell you how long you had been in the meeting, and it does not. So I have no idea where we're at on time. Do you guys feel like we have time to answer 1 or 2 questions?
Yeah, I think so.
I could answer a couple questions.
Cool. I'm going to pull that up. And as a reminder, if any of you guys have any questions for us, you can ask them in our Discord. You can join our Discord by becoming a patron. And you can also leave a comment if you are watching this on YouTube. I can't find my folder. Here it is. All right. So I have a couple questions. Let's just do 2 for today. And then we can fit in another one next episode. Like I said, next episode, we're talking about Universes Beyond. So maybe if you have any specific questions for our thoughts on Universes Beyond, you could send those our way as well. So let's just do 2 today. These are 2 kind of similar questions. I got 2 questions. These are similar questions. So I think I'll just read them both at the same time, and then we can kind of discuss them a little bit because I think they're similar enough questions. First off, we have Jacob H., who I actually believe just became a patron. So thanks for supporting the show, Jacob. Commented,
Jacob.
Great job editing, Jason. Question for you guys. Is there a pet card you've tried building around, but there isn't quite enough support for yet? And then we also have a question from Frey. What is your favorite pet card to sneak into a deck? So pet cards that maybe we shouldn't be playing, but we're playing anyways, or we want to play, but can't quite find a way to play it yet. My answer right now is Original Atali. I find there are a couple decks that I know of that Original Atali is awesome in, but I find of the decks that I own, I just want to play Atali, but maybe I shouldn't. So I did end up finding a home for him, but I think as cool as Original Atali is, there's only a handful of decks where he's really good. You know, like if you can give him haste right away, or you can double his attack trigger or something like that, Atali's awesome. But in the average red deck, I don't think it's worth running. But that's my answer.
I would say a card that I would like to use more is oh gosh, I can't even Amulet of Vigor.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have this dream scenario, right? Where I have Amulet of Vigor on the battlefield, and then I play Summer's Bloom, and I can play 3 additional lands, and I play all of the lands that enter tapped and do something, and then they all untap because of Amulet of Vigor. It just sounds so saucy, dude.
Amulet of Vigor is a fun one to mention since we just spent time talking about mana bases. I only have one deck where I run Amulet of Vigor, and it's my Ramos Charm deck. And it's because almost all of the lands enter tapped without it, so it's worth it.
Unless you're running unless you're trying to put it in there just because you're running a lot of tap lands and you want them to enter untapped, like there's not a whole lot of places for that card to go. I don't ever see people run Amulet of Vigor. I run it in my Joyride deck because it's a 1-mana artifact.
It's a combo piece in Modern. Preston, what about you?
Every 3 to 6 months, I ponder the idea of building a commander deck based around Urza Headmaster and just cheating, using him as a commander. And I'm always like, no, I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't build 5 color Super Friends with Urza. Then 6 months later, I'm like, what if I did? One of these days, I might just do it.
Yeah, and you know what? We're gonna get to a point where that's the 5 color on one, right?
Yeah, 5 color on one. He has a random +1, -1, and
where you have to actually go to a website to see what it does. Yeah. Well, and you know what? we might get to a point where if we keep doing upkeep past season 2, which I think is semi-likely, we might just get to a point where we have to do an episode. So
I have an uncommander deck already built.
all right, there you go. So yeah, maybe
I-
you get to do it, Preston.
I have loved that card ever since me and you did. What was that? Unstable? I think that was that one.
Yeah, it was the second newest one.
Yeah. So me and you did like our own little 2-person draft. I got that card. I think I played it every single round and I won with it. I think because of that card.
Yeah, it was funny because both games, I actually do remember that. Both matches we played, I was like, oh, I think if I get one more turn, I might win. And then you dropped Urza and stabilized. And I was like, damn it.
I
think that happened both
draft
times.
and won.
5-color draft.
I think it was actually 3 rounds, and I think you did win one because I just didn't have them or something.
That might have been true. Yeah. But yeah, that's that is a fun
I
one.
love that card.
Yeah, so that might happen someday. Who knows? We'll see. Leave a comment and let us know if maybe someday you'd like to see an unepisode of Upkeep. But yeah, thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast.
Wait. Did we answer that second question?
Oh, I thought they were kind of the same, similar question.
Well, because I have a different answer for my second.
Okay,
go
ahead. Go ahead.
So I would like to play Amulet of Vigor more. Like I would like to play that in deck sport because it's cool. But the one card that I try to sneak into every commander deck that I ever build is Augur of Autumn. Do you know why?
Because you like looking at the top card of your library?
Because my favorite thing in all of Magic, besides drawing cards, is to say to someone, oh, in response to you doing that, I'm going to look at the top card of my library.
Even if you already know what's there.
And then hearing someone at the table, like, is it different than the last 4 times? And I'm just like, no.
It's
my favorite thing.
Much.
Actually, you know what, Jason? You're making us go back to the main topic because that's a great point. If you have cards in your deck that care about the top card of your library, fetch lands go up in value because then you can change
you're
it.
right. You're right. Didn't think about that.
I'm gonna start slipping a Temple of the False God onto the top of all your decks.
Oh, that would be awful.
That's Preston's pet card right there. It's Temple of the False Gods. The worst land ever printed.
We honestly,
only because it annoys Jason.
We make so many references to Temple of the False God versus Ancient Tomb. We've done that so many times that we really need to just like dedicate an actual video. Like, I don't know if we can do a podcast. I don't know if there's enough substance there to do a whole podcast episode over it, but there's definitely enough substance that we could do some kind of video that's Ancient Tomb.
Right.
I'm gonna get it tattooed.
Yeah. Temple of the False God in a heart. Yeah. Preston's first tattoo. All right. Well, guys, I think that's going to bring us to the end of this week's episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks to talk more about Universes Beyond. Specifically, we're talking about the Doctor Who stuff that's out, but we'll be just talking about Universes Beyond as a whole. So tune in for that conversation. And then in 2 days, we have a new episode of Upkeep coming out. We're playing $100 budget deck. So we have lots of cool stuff coming on the horizon in the near future. Thanks again for Jason for picking up the editing of this podcast. Tell him he's doing a good job. And if you have any questions you'd like us to answer on the air, make sure you leave a comment and or become a patron and hop in our Discord. So you can ask us questions there. And we will see you guys.
Real quick. Sorry, I didn't say this earlier. Who was the first question from?
Jacob H.
Thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it. I hope that you like him, and I'm going to keep doing my best.
Yeah, man. Appreciate the support. We will be seeing you guys later.